The train departed New York at exactly 11:42 p.m. Rain covered the station platforms in shimmering reflections, blurring the bright lights into long streaks across the wet concrete. Travelers hurried toward the doors with backpacks, rolling suitcases, coffee cups, and tired expressions. Loudspeakers echoed through the terminal, announcing final departures while station employees helped the last passengers board. Within minutes, the massive overnight train slowly pulled away from the platform. Steel wheels groaned softly before settling into their familiar rhythm. It was the last direct route to Chicago. More than 200 passengers filled the sleeping cabins and standard coaches. Some were business travelers hoping to sleep through the journey. Others were students returning home. Families occupied several compartments farther back, while elderly couples quietly unpacked blankets and travel pillows. The atmosphere gradually changed as the city disappeared behind them. The conversations became quieter. Laptop screens closed one after another. Books replaced smartphones. One by one, the reading lights faded until only scattered pools of warm yellow light remained throughout the carriage. Outside, skyscrapers gave way to empty industrial districts, then forests swallowed everything beyond the windows. Claire Morgan watched it all silently. She always preferred trains over airplanes. Airplanes erased distance. Trains allowed people to experience it. At 32 years old, Claire had spent nearly a decade working as an investigative journalist. Most of her career involved exposing financial crimes, political corruption, and corporate fraud. Her work had earned awards, lawsuits, and more enemies than friends. Her editor finally insisted she take time off. "You've forgotten what normal life looks like," he had joked. She wasn't entirely sure he was wrong. Chicago wasn't exactly a vacation. It simply wasn't New York. She settled into seat 18A beside the window, placed her backpack beneath the seat, and opened the notebook she carried everywhere. Instead of writing another article, she decided to list places she wanted to visit during the week. Museums. Coffee shops. Bookstores. Absolutely no interviews. For the first time in years, she intended to disappear. About 20 minutes after departure, the conductor entered the carriage. He looked to be in his early 50s. Neatly pressed uniform. Silver name badge. Friendly smile practiced through decades of customer service. Tickets, everyone. Passengers quietly reached for printed tickets or opened digital boarding passes. Claire handed over her phone. The conductor scanned the barcode. "Thank you, Ms. Morgan." His scanner beeped softly. He continued down the aisle. Everything appeared perfectly routine. Until he reached the last 4 rows. His smile faded. He stopped beside seat 22D. Claire noticed immediately because the pause lasted much longer than it should have. The conductor looked at the scanner. Then at the empty seat. Then back at the scanner. His eyebrows tightened. He tapped the screen twice. Scanned again. The device beeped normally. Still. He remained standing there. One of the nearby passengers looked up. "Everything okay?" The conductor smiled politely. "Yes, sir." He continued checking tickets. But Claire noticed something strange. Every few seats he glanced back toward seat 22D. Almost nervously. As though expecting someone to suddenly appear there. When ticket inspection finally ended, he quietly walked into the next carriage without another word. Claire frowned. It was odd. Nothing more. Journalists develop habits. They notice details most people ignore. Usually those details mean nothing. Sometimes. They mean everything. Around midnight, the cafe car closed. Most passengers prepared for sleep. Parents tucked blankets around their children. Someone softly snored 2 rows behind Claire. A college student removed his glasses before falling asleep over an unfinished novel. The train became almost silent except for the constant rhythm of steel wheels beneath the floor. Claire wasn't tired. She opened her laptop and reviewed notes for an unfinished investigation she'd promised herself not to think about during the trip. After 15 minutes she gave up. Vacation meant vacation. She closed the computer and simply watched the darkness outside. Occasionally distant farmhouses appeared like tiny islands of light before disappearing again. At 12:38 a.m., the train entered the Allegheny Tunnel. The darkness outside instantly became absolute. The windows transformed into mirrors reflecting the interior of the carriage. Claire absent-mindedly watched the reflections. Rows of sleeping passengers. Overhead luggage racks. Dim ceiling lights. Then something caught her attention. Someone sat in seat 22D. A man. Tall. Broad shoulders. Dark gray overcoat buttoned almost to the neck. Black leather gloves. His hands rested calmly in his lap. His face remained hidden because the reflection from another light crossed directly over it. Claire blinked. She looked away for barely a second. Then back. The figure remained motionless. No phone. No book. No movement. Simply sitting there. Watching forward. The tunnel ended. Moonlight flooded through the windows once more. Claire instinctively turned toward the actual seat. Empty. Completely empty. She looked back at the window. Only reflections remained. Her pulse quickened slightly. She smiled to herself. It had to be an optical illusion. Someone farther back. Layers of reflection. Simple physics. She'd written enough stories exposing fake ghost sightings to know how easily the brain created patterns in darkness. Still. She couldn't shake the image. About 20 minutes later, a little girl wandered down the aisle clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her parents slowly followed several rows behind. The girl stopped directly beside seat 22D. Claire watched curiously. The child looked toward the empty chair. Smiled warmly. Then quietly whispered. "Good night." She even gave a tiny wave. As though saying goodbye to someone sitting there. Her mother gently called her name. The little girl hurried away without another glance. Claire looked around the carriage. No one else appeared to notice. Not the businessman across the aisle. Not the elderly woman knitting near the back. No one. The empty seat remained exactly that. Empty. By 1:05 a.m., rain began striking the windows again. The sound mixed with the steady rhythm of the train, creating a strangely hypnotic atmosphere. Claire had almost convinced herself she'd imagined everything. Then the conductor returned. This time he looked completely different. His uniform was slightly untidy. His smile had vanished. Tiny beads of sweat covered his forehead despite the cool temperature inside the carriage. Instead of checking tickets, he walked directly toward Claire. He stopped beside her seat. Looked over both shoulders. As if making sure nobody else could hear. Then he leaned closer. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Ms. Morgan." Claire removed one earbud. "Yes." The conductor hesitated. For several long seconds he simply stared toward seat 22D. Finally, he looked back at her. There was unmistakable fear in his eyes. "When you boarded this train, did you happen to see the man sitting in seat 22D? Claire stared at the conductor for several seconds before answering. "I'm not sure." The word sounded weak even to her own ears. She could still picture the reflection in the tunnel. The dark overcoat. The motionless figure. The black leather gloves. Yet every logical part of her mind insisted that nobody had ever actually occupied the seat. The conductor glanced toward the empty chair again. His expression tightened. "I need you to answer carefully." Claire nodded. "I thought I saw someone." "You thought?" "It was only a reflection when we passed through the tunnel." She hesitated. When the train came out, the seat was empty. The conductor's face lost what little color remained. He slowly lowered his scanner. "I was afraid you'd say that." Claire frowned. "What does that mean?" Instead of answering, the conductor looked around the carriage to make sure nobody was listening. Most passengers were asleep. Only the elderly woman near the rear continued knitting beneath a reading light. The businessman across the aisle snored softly. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Too ordinary. The conductor quietly sat in the empty seat beside Claire. "My name is Robert." She nodded politely. "Claire." "I know." He managed a tired smile. I've worked this route for 26 years. His voice remained almost whisper quiet. I've seen medical emergencies. Storms. Broken engines. Even derailments. He paused. But I've never seen this happen to anyone outside the railway staff. Claire leaned forward. What exactly is happening? Robert slowly removed a small notebook from his jacket pocket. The leather cover had become worn with age. Inside were dozens of handwritten dates. Times. Train numbers. Short notes. Many pages had been crossed out in red ink. Others carried question marks. Claire immediately recognized the habits of someone documenting events over many years. Robert opened to one particular page. The date was nearly 18 years old. October 14th. Train 71. Seat 22D. Underneath appeared one handwritten sentence. Passenger vanished before first stop. Claire looked up. What is this? Robert turned another page. A different year. Different handwriting. Same seat. Nobody remembers boarding him. Another page. Child spoke to empty seat. Another. Reflection visible. Chair empty. Claire felt her stomach tighten. You're joking. I wish I were. He closed the notebook. For 18 years. The same seat. The same reports. The same impossible details. Claire forced herself to laugh. There has to be an explanation. There probably is. Robert nodded. I've simply never found it. He looked toward seat 22D again. I've learned something over the years. Claire waited. If someone notices him. Something always happens before sunrise. A chill spread through her body. Him. Robert immediately realized what he'd said. He looked away. I shouldn't have used that word. But you did. He sighed. Because eventually everyone who investigates starts talking about him as if he's a real passenger. Silence settled between them. The train continued racing through the rain. Claire looked toward the empty chair. Nothing. Just blue fabric beneath soft overhead lights. No mysterious figure. No movement. Only an ordinary seat. Her rational mind wanted to dismiss the entire conversation. But another part of her, the investigative journalist who had built a career chasing uncomfortable truths, refused to ignore the growing pattern. She reached into her backpack. I want to see the passenger manifest. Robert looked surprised. Why? If someone was assigned that seat, there has to be a record. Robert hesitated. Then quietly nodded. Come with me. They left the carriage together. The narrow corridor connecting the coaches swayed gently beneath their feet. Rain hammered against the windows. The farther they walked, the quieter the train became. Robert unlocked a small staff compartment near the dining car. Inside stood filing cabinets, radio equipment, emergency supplies, and a computer terminal connected to the railway network. He logged into the passenger database. Train 71. Departure, New York. Destination, Chicago. Passenger list appeared instantly. Claire leaned closer. Seat 22D. She expected to see a name. Instead, the system displayed only a gray box. No passenger information. No reservation number. No payment record. Nothing. Robert quietly pointed at the screen. It wasn't like that when we left New York. Claire looked at him. What do you mean? I personally checked every reservation before departure. There was a passenger assigned to seat 22D. So where's the name? Robert swallowed. It disappeared. Claire frowned. Databases don't just erase people. I know. I printed the manifest before we departed. He opened a drawer. Removed a folded sheet of paper. Spread it across the desk. Seat 22D. A name had clearly been printed there. Except someone, or something, had blurred the ink. Every other passenger remained perfectly readable. Only that single line had become completely illegible. Claire touched the paper. The ink wasn't smeared. It looked as though it had simply faded away. While she stared at the impossible document, the radio on Robert's desk suddenly crackled to life. Static filled the tiny speaker. Then a nervous voice came through. "Robert." It was another conductor from farther back on the train. "We've got a problem." Robert grabbed the radio. "What happened?" Several seconds of silence followed. When the voice finally returned, it was shaking. "A passenger is missing." Robert's expression hardened. "Who?" The answer came quietly. "So far, we don't know." Then the radio went silent. Robert stared at the silent radio for several seconds. His grip tightened around the microphone until his knuckles turned white. Claire immediately noticed the change in his expression. "You've had missing passengers before, haven't you?" Robert slowly nodded. "Only when someone sees seat 22D. The words hung heavily in the small staff compartment. Outside, the train continued racing through the darkness at nearly 80 miles an hour. Rain battered the windows so hard that the world beyond the glass had become nothing more than shifting shadows. Claire folded her arms. "Explain everything." Robert leaned against the desk and took a slow breath. 18 years ago I was a junior conductor. It was my 3rd month on this route. He opened the old notebook again. The first incident happened during a snowstorm. There was a man sitting in seat 22D. Claire interrupted. "Was anyone actually assigned to that seat?" "Yes." Robert nodded. "At least, that's what everyone believed." He turned another page. "We checked his ticket. We spoke to him. We even served him dinner." Claire frowned. "Then what happened?" Robert looked directly into her eyes. "When the train arrived in Pittsburgh, the seat was empty. So the passenger simply vanished." Claire shrugged. "People leave trains." Robert shook his head. "He never did. We reviewed every station camera. No one matching his description ever stepped onto the platform. No emergency exits had opened. No doors malfunctioned. There was simply no trace that he'd ever existed." Claire remained silent. Robert continued. "The stranger sitting beside him insisted they'd spent 2 hours talking. The waitress remembered bringing him coffee. The ticket scanner confirmed his ticket had been checked." He paused. "But by morning, the scanner contained no record. The security cameras never showed him boarding. The coffee cup disappeared. The passenger list changed. It was as if reality had quietly corrected itself." Claire tried to find a rational explanation. Corrupted files. Faulty memories. Someone running an elaborate hoax. Yet none of them explained everything together. The compartment door suddenly opened. A young conductor rushed inside. He looked barely 25. His breathing was uneven. "Robert. What happened?" "The missing passenger." Robert stood immediately. "Who is it?" "We still don't know." Claire frowned. "How can someone disappear if you don't know who they are?" The young conductor looked confused. "That's exactly the problem." He handed Robert a tablet displaying the digital passenger list. "There are supposed to be 214 passengers." Robert checked the number. "So? We counted. There are only 213. Claire blinked. "Then compare the names." "We did. They're all here." Robert slowly lowered the tablet. "No." The younger conductor nodded. "We counted 3 times. The total number of passengers doesn't match. But nobody is missing from the list." Silence filled the room. Claire felt a chill spread across her back. The mathematics made no sense. 214 tickets had been sold. 213 people remained on board. Yet every ticket still belonged to someone present. One passenger existed. Without existing. Robert grabbed his radio again. "I'm coming." The 3 hurried back through the narrow corridor. Several passengers had awakened after noticing railway staff rushing between carriages. Whispers spread quickly. A woman asked whether there had been an accident. Someone else mentioned a medical emergency. No one received an answer. When Claire returned to her carriage, she immediately noticed something different. Seat 22D was no longer empty. A black leather briefcase rested neatly on the cushion. She froze. I'm sure that wasn't there. Robert looked toward the seat. His face became pale. Nobody touch it. The surrounding passengers exchanged confused looks. What briefcase? Claire stared at them. The one on the seat. The businessman across the aisle frowned. There isn't anything there. Claire looked back. The briefcase remained perfectly visible. Old-fashioned. Worn leather. Silver combination locks. Rainwater glistened across its surface as though someone had carried it aboard only moments earlier. Robert whispered quietly. You can see it too. Claire nodded. Yes. Neither of them moved. Robert slowly approached the seat. His hand trembled as he reached toward the briefcase. Just before touching it, the train lights suddenly went out. Complete darkness swallowed the carriage. Several passengers gasped. Children began crying farther down the train. Only the emergency lighting remained, casting everything in a faint blue glow. The blackout lasted less than 5 seconds. When the main lights returned, seat 22D was empty again. The briefcase had vanished. Robert stepped backward. His breathing had become noticeably faster. Claire looked around. No one else seemed alarmed. Most passengers simply returned to their conversations, assuming the brief blackout had been caused by the storm. Then, a voice quietly spoke from directly behind Claire. Excuse me. She turned. An elderly woman stood in the aisle holding a photograph. Her hands shook violently. I think. She swallowed hard. I think I remember who disappeared. Claire looked down at the faded photograph. There were 6 people standing beside an old passenger train. One face had been circled in blue ink. The man wore a dark gray overcoat, black leather gloves, and he looked exactly like the figure Claire had seen reflected in the tunnel. Claire accepted the photograph with both hands. The paper felt old, far older than it should have. Its edges had yellowed with age, and faint cracks ran across the glossy surface as though it had been folded and unfolded hundreds of times over the years. The image showed 6 smiling railway employees standing beside a polished silver passenger train. Judging by the style of the uniforms and the locomotive behind them, the photograph had to be at least 20 years old. One face had been circled with blue ink. The man wore a charcoal gray overcoat instead of a railway uniform. His hands were covered by black leather gloves despite what appeared to be warm spring weather. Unlike everyone else in the picture, he wasn't smiling. He was looking directly into the camera. Or at least, it felt as though he was looking directly at Claire. She couldn't explain why. There was nothing unusual about the photograph itself, yet the stranger's eyes seemed unnervingly alive. Every time she shifted the angle of the picture, the expression remained exactly the same, calm, unreadable, almost patient. Robert leaned closer. I've seen that face before. Claire looked up. You have? He nodded slowly. Not in person. In photographs. His voice had become quieter. Every few years someone shows me another picture. Always a different decade. Always a different train. And somehow, it's always the same man. Claire frowned. That's impossible. I know. The elderly woman who had handed them the photograph sat down heavily in the nearest seat. Her breathing was shallow. My husband collected railway photographs, she explained. After he died, I found this one inside one of his albums. She pointed toward the circled figure. He told me never to throw it away. Claire waited. He said if I ever traveled on a night train and saw that man. The woman's hands began to tremble. I should leave before sunrise. Silence settled over the carriage. Outside, rain lashed against the windows. The train continued west without slowing, its wheels producing the steady metallic rhythm that had seemed comforting only an hour earlier. Now the sound felt different. Almost ominous. Claire looked at Robert. Did your notebook mention photographs? Robert opened it immediately. Several pages contained rough sketches instead of written notes. Most were simple seat layouts. Others showed train windows. Near the center of the notebook, however, one page displayed a hand-drawn rectangle with a short note beneath it. Passenger appears in historical photographs. Identity unknown. Claire looked back at the elderly woman. May I ask your name? Evelyn. When did your husband tell you about this? She thought for a moment. About 12 years ago. And where did he get the photograph? He never said. He only claimed someone mailed it to him. No return address. No letter. Just the photograph. Claire carefully turned the picture over. The back appeared almost blank. Almost. Near one corner, faded pencil marks formed a single date. October 9, 1987. Nothing else. Robert noticed it too. That's strange. Claire looked at him. Why? He quickly flipped through his notebook until reaching the very first page. The earliest entry wasn't 18 years old. It was much older. Someone else had written it before him. Different handwriting. Different pen. The same date. October 9, 1987. Below it appeared only one sentence. Do not assign anyone to seat 22D after midnight. Claire felt a chill crawl across her arms. Who wrote this? Robert slowly closed the notebook. My predecessor. He retired before I started. What happened to him? He disappeared. The words came so quietly that Claire almost didn't hear them. Disappeared? Robert nodded. He finished one overnight shift. Went home. And was never seen again. The train suddenly lurched. Coffee cups rattled. Passengers instinctively grabbed their armrests. The brakes engaged with a long metallic screech before releasing again. The unexpected slowdown lasted only a few seconds. Then the train resumed its normal speed. Confused murmurs spread throughout the carriage. Claire looked through the window. They weren't approaching a station. Only endless forest stretched into the darkness. Robert immediately reached for his radio. Engine room. Static. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. The younger conductor hurried down the aisle. Robert. What now? The locomotive isn't responding. What do you mean? The engineer says the controls ignored his command for almost 8 seconds. Claire exchanged a glance with Robert. Modern trains weren't supposed to do that. Multiple independent safety systems prevented almost every type of mechanical failure. Robert hurried toward the front of the train. Claire followed despite him telling her to stay behind. She couldn't. Every instinct as a journalist told her the story had only just begun. The front locomotive was separated from the passenger cars by a narrow service corridor. As they approached, they found 2 engineers standing outside the control cabin. Both looked deeply unsettled. One of them pointed at the digital event recorder. It accelerated. Robert frowned. What? We reduced power because of an obstruction warning. The train ignored us. Claire stepped closer. What obstruction? The older engineer replayed the recording. A forward-facing camera appeared on the monitor. Rain obscured much of the track. Then, for a fraction of a second, a person stood directly between the rails. Gray overcoat. Black gloves. Motionless. Claire's heart skipped a beat. The train should have struck him. Instead, the recording glitched into static. When the image returned, the tracks were empty. The engineer rewound the footage. The figure appeared again. Always in the same place. Always standing perfectly still. Robert whispered almost to himself. No. The engineer looked confused. What? Robert pointed toward the timestamp in the corner of the screen. It says 1:42. So. Robert slowly turned toward Claire. His face had become completely pale. When the camera recorded that, the train was inside a tunnel. Claire stared at him. There are no tracks outside the tunnel. No crossings. No open sky. Nothing. She looked back at the frozen image. Rain. Forest. Open railway. A man standing calmly on the tracks. An image that could not possibly exist. Then the monitor flickered once. The recording advanced by itself. The stranger slowly raised his head. Looked directly into the camera. And smiled. For several long seconds, no one in the locomotive spoke. The image remained frozen on the monitor. The smiling man stood alone in the middle of the tracks, rain falling around him in silver streaks. His gray overcoat hung perfectly still despite the wind visible in the surrounding trees. The black leather gloves looked unnaturally clean, untouched by the mud covering the railway embankment. Claire leaned closer to the screen. Play it again. The older engineer hesitated. I already have. I want to see the entire recording. He nodded and rewound the footage. The timestamp rolled backward. 1 hour 41 minutes and 52 seconds. 1 hour 41 minutes and 47 seconds. The video resumed. The track stretched into darkness beneath the locomotive's headlights. Rain blurred the rails, occasionally reflecting bright flashes of white as water pooled between the sleepers. Nothing unusual. The train continued forward. Trees rushed past. Signal lights appeared and disappeared. Then, without warning, the video skipped. Not glitched. Skipped. One frame showed empty tracks. The next showed the stranger already standing there. No movement. No arrival. He hadn't walked onto the rails. He simply existed. Claire pointed immediately. There. The engineer paused the recording. What? Frame by frame. He slowed the playback to its lowest speed. The four people crowded around the monitor watched every individual frame. Empty tracks. Empty tracks. Empty tracks. Then. The man. Perfectly still. Claire felt a knot tighten in her stomach. I've edited enough surveillance footage to know when something's been inserted. Robert looked at her. And? It doesn't look edited. She wished it had. Because if it wasn't. She had no explanation at all. The younger conductor cleared his throat. Maybe the camera malfunctioned. The engineer shook his head. The locomotive records simultaneously on 3 independent systems. He opened another window. Then another. Each displayed footage from a different backup recorder. Every camera showed the exact same thing. The stranger. Standing motionless. Watching the approaching train. Robert quietly whispered, 3 systems can't fail in exactly the same way. Claire's attention shifted to the timestamp again. Something bothered her. Can you show me the GPS log? The engineer nodded. He opened another panel. A detailed map appeared beside columns of technical data. Train speed. Brake pressure. Engine output. Location. Claire followed the coordinates carefully. The timestamp on the mysterious footage pointed to mile marker 214. Robert leaned over her shoulder. What is it? Claire traced the route with her finger. The train couldn't have been here. The engineer frowned. It was. No. She shook her head. According to the schedule, we entered the Allegheny Tunnel at 1:39. She pointed farther along the map. This location is nearly 5 miles beyond the tunnel. Robert understood immediately. But we didn't leave the tunnel until 1:46. Claire finished the sentence. Silence. The train had somehow recorded open tracks while physically traveling beneath a mountain. The engineer slowly removed his glasses. I don't believe in ghosts. Neither do I, Claire answered. But I do believe in facts. And the facts don't agree with each other. A sharp knock interrupted them. Another railway employee stepped into the locomotive. He looked nervous. Robert. What now? The passengers. What about them? They're arguing. Robert sighed. Over what? The employee swallowed. They can't agree how many people are in coach 3. Claire exchanged another glance with Robert. What does that mean? Half of them insist every seat is occupied. The other half swear there are empty rows. Robert immediately followed him. Claire didn't wait for permission. She hurried after them. Coach 3 lay only 2 carriages behind Claire's own seat. The moment she entered, she realized something was wrong. The atmosphere had changed completely. Passengers stood in the aisle speaking over one another. Some looked confused. Others genuinely frightened. A middle-aged businessman pointed toward the rear of the carriage. "I'm telling you, there was a woman sitting there an hour ago." His wife frowned. "There wasn't." "Yes, there was." "No. I watched her reading a magazine." "You've been asleep since midnight." Nearby, a college student argued with an elderly couple. "There are 4 empty seats." The old man shook his head. "What empty seats? The carriage is full." Claire slowly walked down the aisle. Her heartbeat quickened. To her left, seat 31A appeared occupied by a young woman wearing headphones. Claire could see her clearly. Brown hair. Blue sweater. Travel backpack resting beside her feet. She looked completely ordinary. Claire turned toward Robert. "Do you see her?" He looked directly at the seat. His face became blank. "See who?" Claire looked back. The woman smiled politely. As though she'd heard the question. Claire swallowed. "Seat 31A." Robert stared. "The seat's empty." Claire felt cold. Very cold. She stepped closer. The woman continued reading her book. Claire could even see the title. The Invisible Passenger. She blinked. The cover changed. Now it showed nothing. Just blank gray fabric. The seat was empty. A little boy suddenly tugged at Claire's sleeve. He couldn't have been older than 8. He pointed farther down the carriage. "He's walking." Claire followed his finger. At the very end of the coach, a tall man in a gray overcoat moved slowly through the connecting door. His back remained turned. Black leather gloves. Unhurried steps. He disappeared into the next carriage. Claire ran. She pushed through the swinging door. Coach 4. Empty aisle. Sleeping passengers. No gray coat. No footsteps. No sound. The man had vanished. She searched both ends of the carriage. Nothing. Impossible. Robert caught up moments later. "What happened?" "I saw him." His expression changed immediately. "You actually saw him?" "He walked through here." Robert looked toward the sleeping passengers. "No one came through this door." Claire shook her head. "I watched him." Robert reached into his pocket. His notebook. Hands trembling slightly. He turned to a page Claire hadn't seen before. At the top someone had written in faded ink. Stage 2. Below it. Only one sentence. "Once he begins walking, the train never reaches its destination." For several seconds, Claire simply stared at the sentence. The words looked older than the rest of the notebook. The ink had faded to a dull brown, and the edges of the page were brittle enough that Robert turned it with extraordinary care. "Once he begins walking, the train never reaches its destination." Claire slowly looked up. "What does that mean?" Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed the notebook and slipped it back into the inside pocket of his jacket. "I don't know." "You wrote it?" "No." He shook his head. "It was already there when the notebook was passed to me." Claire frowned. "Passed?" Robert nodded. "Every senior conductor on this route leaves the notebook for the next one." The sentence hung in the air. Claire blinked. "What?" "It's never been official. There are no railway records. No training manuals. No reports. Just the notebook." He looked toward the window. "And every conductor who inherits it adds whatever they experience." Claire folded her arms. "So for decades you've all been documenting the same thing. Without telling the company?" Robert gave a bitter smile. "The first few people did. And they lost their jobs." Claire wasn't surprised. A railway company couldn't exactly publish reports claiming a mysterious passenger appeared only in reflections. Still, Something about the notebook bothered her. If this has been happening for decades, why is this train still operating? Robert hesitated. Because most journeys end normally. Most? He nodded. The strange things don't always continue. Sometimes someone notices seat 22D. Nothing happens. Sometimes they see the reflection. Still nothing. He sighed. But every incident that reached stage 2 ended differently. Claire's stomach tightened. How many? Robert looked directly at her. I know of 4. 4 trains. 4 disappearances. Silence settled between them. The train continued rolling through the night. Its steady rhythm suddenly sounded much louder. Much heavier. Claire looked around coach 4. Passengers had gradually settled down again after the earlier confusion. Most believed the arguments had simply been caused by fatigue. No one suspected anything deeper. No one except the railway staff. And Claire. The little boy who had pointed toward the gray-coated man still sat beside his mother near the rear of the carriage. He was quietly drawing in a coloring book. Claire walked over. His mother looked up. I'm sorry to bother you. It's all right. Claire crouched beside the child. You said you saw someone walking. The boy nodded. The tall man. What did he look like? Like everybody else. Claire smiled gently. What do you mean? He changes. The answer surprised her. Changes? The boy continued coloring. When I first saw him, he looked like Grandpa. My grandpa died 2 years ago. Claire exchanged a quick glance with Robert. The child kept talking without looking up. Then he looked like the ticket man. The conductor. The boy nodded. And then. He paused. He looked like you. Claire felt every muscle in her body tense. What? The boy finally looked up at her. But only for a second. His expression remained completely innocent. Then he became the gray man again. Claire stood slowly. Children imagine things. They mixed dreams with reality. She knew that. Yet something about the certainty in his voice unsettled her. Robert quietly touched her shoulder. We need to go. Where? The storage car. Why? I want to show you something. They walked through 2 more coaches before reaching a locked service compartment used for luggage and maintenance equipment. Robert unlocked the heavy door. Cold air drifted out. Rows of metal shelves stretched into darkness. Emergency tools. Replacement electrical parts. Boxes of bottled water. Nothing unusual. At first. Robert led her toward the far wall. Mounted there hung dozens of framed photographs. Every one showed railway employees. Retirement ceremonies. Holiday parties. Award presentations. Claire scanned them casually. Then stopped. A photograph dated 1998 showed an entire crew standing beside this very train. One face caught her eye. Gray overcoat. Black gloves. Exactly the same man. She hurried to the next frame. 2006. The same face. Another. 2014. Again. He never appeared in the center. Never smiled. Always stood near the edge of the group. As though accidentally included. Claire quickly moved from frame to frame. Different decades. Different employees. Different cameras. The same stranger. He hadn't aged. Not even slightly. Robert spoke quietly behind her. I noticed him 6 years ago. You never told anyone. I did. He laughed softly. My supervisor thought I was seeing patterns. Claire leaned closer to one photograph. Something else caught her attention. Every picture had been taken years apart. Yet the stranger wore the exact same overcoat. The exact same gloves. Even the folds in the fabric appeared identical. Almost as though. It wasn't the man moving through time. It was the same photograph appearing again and again. Claire removed her phone. I'm taking pictures. She photographed every frame. When she finished. She opened the gallery. Every image had saved normally. Except one. The photograph from 1998. Instead of the railway staff. The picture now showed an empty platform. No people. Nothing. Claire frowned. She opened another image. The 2006 photograph. Also empty. One by one she checked every picture she'd taken. Every group photograph had changed. Only abandoned stations remained. The stranger was gone. The railway employees were gone. It was as though no one had ever stood there. Robert quietly whispered. They always disappear. Claire slowly lowered the phone. Always. I've tried photographing them before. They never stay. A loud metallic bang echoed somewhere beneath the floor. The train shuddered violently. Boxes slid from the storage shelves. Emergency lights flickered. Claire grabbed the nearest railing to keep her balance. The brakes engaged hard. Passengers screamed throughout the train. The entire carriage lurched forward as steel wheels shrieked against the rails. Then. Silence. Complete silence. The train had stopped. Not at a station. Not beside a platform. In the middle of nowhere. Robert immediately checked his watch. His expression changed. Claire noticed. What? He slowly raised his wrist. The second hand wasn't moving. Neither was the minute hand. His watch had stopped at exactly 2:22 a.m. Claire instinctively looked at her phone. No signal. Battery, 87%. Time. 2:22 a.m. It refused to change. Around them, passengers began pulling out their own phones. Confused voices filled the carriage. My clock froze. So did mine. My smartwatch just rebooted. Outside the windows, dense fog rolled across the tracks, hiding everything beyond a few yards. Then, through the white mist, a station slowly emerged. Old brick platforms. Rusted iron lamps. A faded station sign. Claire pressed her face against the glass. She could barely make out the letters. One by one, they became visible. Blackridge Station. Robert staggered backward. His face had turned completely white. That's impossible. Claire looked at him. You know this place? Robert swallowed. It was demolished. 31 years ago. No one inside the carriage spoke. The only sound came from the cooling metal beneath the train, ticking softly after the emergency stop. Claire remained pressed against the window. Outside, the fog drifted slowly across the abandoned platform. Old cast-iron lamps lined the station, their yellow light flickering weakly despite the fact that there was no visible source of electricity. The brick building at the center of the platform looked untouched by time. Its windows were dark, yet not a single pane was broken. A faded station clock hung above the entrance. It also read 2:22. Claire glanced back at her phone. Still frozen. 2:22. Robert quietly whispered, "Don't open the doors." Claire turned toward him. "They're locked anyway." Robert shook his head. "No. They aren't." He pointed toward the carriage entrance. The electronic indicator that normally displayed doors locked while in motion had gone dark. Instead, a single green light glowed above the handle. The doors could be opened manually. That should have been impossible. Modern passenger trains disabled every emergency release unless the conductor activated it. Robert grabbed his radio. Engine room. Only static answered. He tried another frequency. Nothing. Even the emergency railway channel remained silent. The younger conductor hurried into the carriage, breathing hard. "Robert. What happened?" "The engineers are gone." Claire stared. "What?" "We went to check the locomotive. The control cabin is empty." Robert frowned. "They wouldn't leave their post." "They didn't." The young conductor's voice trembled. "The coffee is still warm. The control panel is still active. The headlights are on. But there isn't anyone there." Claire felt a cold knot form in her stomach. 3 minutes ago she had been speaking to both engineers. Now they had simply vanished. Robert immediately moved toward the front of the train. Claire followed without asking permission. The connecting corridor felt strangely different. The lights flickered every few seconds, casting long shadows across the walls. Passengers stood in small groups whispering nervously. Several had already noticed the mysterious station outside. An elderly man spoke quietly to his wife. "I used to pass through Blackridge when I was a child." His wife looked confused. "But that station closed before we met." "I know." Claire stopped walking. She looked back. The old man frowned. "Did I say Blackridge?" His wife nodded slowly. "I've never heard of Blackridge." The man blinked several times. He looked genuinely confused. "I don't know why I said that." Claire continued toward the locomotive. The front control cabin stood exactly as the young conductor had described. The engineer's cap rested on the dashboard. A clipboard lay open beside the throttle. 2 steaming cups of coffee remained on the console. One still had steam rising from it. It was as though both men had stood up at exactly the same moment. And ceased to exist. Claire inspected the floor carefully. No signs of struggle. No blood. No footprints leading away. Nothing. Only silence. The train itself remained powered. The control displays still glowed softly. The brakes remained fully engaged. Robert slowly sat in the engineer's chair. "This isn't possible." Claire studied the digital route map. Something immediately caught her attention. According to the navigation system, the train wasn't stopped. It was still moving. Speed: 79 miles per hour. Distance to Chicago: 428 miles. She pointed at the screen. "Robert." He leaned closer. The GPS insisted the train continued racing west across Pennsylvania. Yet outside the windshield, Blackridge Station remained perfectly still. The contradiction made no sense. The younger conductor suddenly looked through the front window. His face lost all color. "Someone's there." Everyone turned. A lone figure stood on the empty platform. Gray overcoat. Black leather gloves. Hands folded behind his back. He wasn't moving. He simply watched the train. Claire immediately recognized him. The same man from the tunnel. The same man from the photographs. The same man the little boy had seen walking through the coaches. Robert whispered. "Don't look into his eyes." Claire didn't respond. She couldn't. The stranger slowly tilted his head. Almost as though acknowledging that she'd recognized him. Then he smiled. Not a wide smile. Not threatening. Almost welcoming. A deep metallic clang echoed somewhere beneath the train. The platform lights flickered. The station loudspeakers suddenly crackled to life. Static filled the night. Then a calm male voice echoed across the empty station. "Train 71. The announcement sounded old, distorted by ancient speakers. "Now arriving on platform 1. Claire frowned. No other train existed. They were already there. The announcement continued. "Please allow departing passengers to exit first." Robert's breathing became uneven. "No." Claire looked at him. "What?" "There aren't supposed to be any departing passengers." The station doors slowly opened. One by one. The waiting room. The ticket office. The baggage room. Every entrance creaked open by itself. Yet no one came out. The platform remained empty. Except for the gray-coated man. Suddenly, a soft ding echoed through every carriage. The same pleasant electronic tone normally heard before station stops. Then the automated onboard announcement began. Only, it wasn't the usual recorded voice. Instead, a calm unfamiliar voice spoke through every speaker on the train. "Passengers." A long pause followed. "Please remember your names." Confused murmurs spread through the coaches. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. The announcement continued. If you cannot remember your name, please remain seated. Another pause. If someone calls your name, do not answer. The speakers went silent. For several seconds, no one moved. Then, somewhere near the middle of the train, a woman screamed. The sound echoed through every carriage. Claire ran toward it. Robert and the young conductor followed close behind. They reached coach 3 within seconds. Passengers stood in the aisle, pointing toward the rear. A middle-aged woman clutched her husband, shaking uncontrollably. What happened? Claire asked. The woman slowly raised a trembling finger. There was a little girl. Claire's heart sank. The one with the stuffed rabbit? The woman nodded. She walked to seat 22D. And the woman's voice broke. She turned around and asked her mother, "Mom, who am I?" The word settled over the carriage like a layer of ice. No one moved. The woman who had screamed still clung to her husband, unable to stop shaking. Tears streamed down her face as she stared toward the center of the coach. Claire slowly looked in the direction she was pointing. The little girl stood exactly where the woman had described. She still held the stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. She looked frightened. Confused. Not because she had been hurt, but because she genuinely didn't understand something that should have been impossible to forget. Her mother knelt in front of her, holding both of the child's shoulders. "Sweetheart. It's Mommy." The little girl blinked. "I know." Her voice trembled. "But..." She looked around the carriage. "Who am I?" Silence. The question struck everyone harder than a scream would have. Children forgot toys, homework, birthdays. They did not forget their own names. Her father hurried over and crouched beside them. "You're Emily." The girl repeated the name quietly. "Emily." She frowned. "It sounds familiar. But it doesn't feel like mine." Claire felt a chill spread through her entire body. The girl's expression wasn't blank. She wasn't pretending. She wasn't confused in the ordinary sense. She looked exactly like someone trying to remember a dream that disappeared the moment they woke up. Robert quietly motioned Claire aside. "This happened before." She turned toward him. "Someone forgot who they were." Robert nodded. "4 years ago." "What happened?" The passenger remembered. Claire waited. Robert swallowed. "After the train reached daylight. And..." He remembered everyone else's name. But not his own. Claire stared at him. "What became of him?" Robert looked away. "He disappeared 3 days later." Before Claire could ask another question, another passenger suddenly stood up. A young businessman near the window looked around with growing panic. "Excuse me." Nobody answered. He looked directly at the elderly woman knitting 2 rows ahead. Do you know my name?" The woman frowned. "You were sitting beside your wife." The businessman turned toward the woman next to him. She looked equally frightened. "I'm sorry." She hesitated. "I don't remember." He laughed nervously. "Very funny." She slowly shook her head. "I'm serious. I know you're my husband. I just can't remember what to call you." Claire's pulse quickened. It wasn't isolated anymore. People throughout the carriage began quietly asking one another simple questions. "What's my middle name? How old am I? What street do we live on?" Most answered correctly. Some hesitated. A few couldn't answer at all. The atmosphere changed from confusion to fear in less than a minute. Robert immediately stood in the aisle. Everyone remained calm. His voice carried through the carriage. "Stress affects memory. We'll stop at the next station." Several passengers laughed bitterly. "What station?" "We're already stopped." Claire looked out the window again. Blackridge Station hadn't changed. The platform remained empty. The gray-coated stranger still stood exactly where he had been. He hadn't moved an inch. Almost as if time itself had frozen around him. Then something impossible happened. He slowly raised one gloved hand. Not toward the train. Toward Claire. A small gesture. Almost like an invitation. She felt an overwhelming urge to step outside. Just for a moment. Just long enough to ask who he was. To demand answers. Without realizing it, Claire took a single step toward the carriage door. Robert immediately grabbed her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. Don't. Claire blinked. What? You were walking. She looked down. She was standing only a few feet from the emergency exit. She had no memory of leaving her seat. Robert quietly whispered. Never let him decide where you stand. A loud metallic click echoed through the train. Every passenger turned simultaneously. The carriage doors had unlocked. One by one. With perfect synchronization. Click. 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 Throughout the entire train. The green emergency indicators illuminated together. No one touched them. Yet several doors slowly slid open by themselves. Cold night air rushed inside. Fog drifted into the coaches, rolling gently across the floor like pale smoke. Passengers instinctively backed away. Claire stared outside. Blackridge Station looked even clearer now. She could finally read the faded timetable mounted beside the waiting room. Every arrival listed the same destination. Every departure listed the same destination. There were no city names. Only one word repeated over and over. Unknown. The station loudspeaker crackled again. This time the voice sounded much closer. Almost as though the speaker stood beside the train. Passengers. A pause. Boarding will begin shortly. Robert's breathing became uneven. No. Claire looked at him. What does that mean? He answered without taking his eyes off the platform. It means. This train isn't the only one here. A deep horn suddenly echoed through the valley. Long. Low. Powerful. Not from their locomotive. From somewhere inside the fog. Passengers rushed toward the windows. Claire looked down the tracks. At first. She saw nothing. Then two distant headlights appeared. They were motionless for only a second. Then they began moving. Slowly. Silently. A second train emerged from the white fog. It looked ancient. Its dark green carriages belonged in another century. Every window glowed with warm yellow light. Figures sat inside every compartment. Dozens of passengers. Perfectly still. None of them moved. None of them spoke. As the ghostly train rolled closer, Claire realized something that made her blood run cold. Every passenger inside was looking directly at train 71. Waiting. As if expecting someone to get off. The ancient train moved without making a sound. That was the first thing Claire noticed. Its wheels rolled over the rails, yet there was no metallic rhythm, no vibration, no screech of steel against steel. Even the rain seemed to avoid it. The droplets passed through the yellow glow surrounding the carriages and vanished before touching the dark green paint. The only sound came from the breathing of the passengers inside train 71. Every eye in coach 3 was fixed on the approaching locomotive. The old engine looked as though it belonged in the 1940s. A brass number plate hung beneath the smokestack. The digits were barely visible through decades of wear. 22. Claire felt her pulse quicken. Robert whispered beside her. That's impossible. You've seen it before. He slowly shook his head. I've heard stories. What kind of stories? My predecessor. Robert swallowed. He believed there was another train. Claire looked at him. He called it the return line. Before Claire could ask what that meant, the ancient locomotive came to a gentle stop opposite train 71. Its brakes made no sound. Its headlights dimmed simultaneously. Then every carriage door opened at once. No conductor stepped onto the platform. No announcements followed. Nothing moved. The passengers inside remained perfectly still. Men. Women. Children. All dressed in clothing from different decades. Some wore business suits from the 1980s. Others military uniforms far older. Several children wore fashions Claire had only seen in history books. Yet they all shared one unsettling detail. None of them blinked. Claire tried to convince herself they were mannequins. Until one little boy slowly lifted his hand. And waved. Not at everyone. At the little girl holding the stuffed rabbit. Emily. The child instinctively waved back. Her mother immediately pulled her close. No. Emily looked confused. But he smiled at me. Claire followed the boy's gaze. He couldn't have been older than 7. His clothes looked old-fashioned. His expression was warm. Kind. Almost familiar. Then Claire noticed something else. The seat number above him. 22D. Her stomach tightened. She quickly looked farther down the carriage. Another passenger. Seat 22D. Another carriage. Again. Every coach on the ancient train contained a seat 22D. And every one of them was occupied. Robert had noticed it too. His face had gone completely pale. The station loudspeaker crackled. Transfer passengers. A pause. Please prepare to board. Immediately, something changed inside train 71. Passengers began looking around nervously. Some frowned. Others blinked several times as though struggling to stay awake. Claire suddenly heard a quiet voice behind her. Mom. She turned. Emily stood perfectly still. The stuffed rabbit had slipped from her hand. I remember my name. Her mother burst into tears and embraced her. Claire smiled with relief. Then Emily quietly added. But. I also remember another one. Silence. What do you mean? Her mother asked. Emily looked toward the ancient train. A different name. A different family. The carriage became deathly quiet. Claire slowly crouched beside the child. What name? Emily closed her eyes. Her lips trembled. She frowned in frustration. It's disappearing. Robert interrupted. Don't force it. Emily opened her eyes again. It's gone. Before anyone could speak, a loud knock echoed through coach 3. Everyone turned. The sound had come from outside. Someone was knocking on the train window. Claire's heart nearly stopped. The man in the gray overcoat stood inches from the glass. He looked directly at her. His gloved hand rested against the window. One gentle knock. Then another. His lips moved. No sound reached them. Claire unconsciously stepped closer. She could read lips well enough from years of interviews. The stranger repeated the same sentence twice. You're on the wrong train. Claire froze. The words echoed inside her mind. She looked toward Robert. I think. Before she could finish, every light inside train 71 went out. Darkness swallowed the coaches. Only the ghost train outside continued glowing with its warm golden lights. Gasps echoed through the carriage. Someone screamed. Emergency lights failed to activate. For the first time since leaving New York. There was no electricity anywhere aboard the train. Only moonlight entered through the windows. Claire could barely make out the faces around her. Then. A different sound filled the darkness. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Walking through the aisle. Not running. Not searching. Simply walking. One step. Then another. The footsteps grew closer. Passengers held their breath. No one dared speak. Claire listened carefully. The sound came from the rear of the carriage. Moving forward. Toward seat 22D. Robert quietly whispered. Don't look. Claire ignored him. She had spent her career chasing the truth. She wasn't about to close her eyes now. The footsteps stopped beside seat 22D. Silence returned. Then. The overhead reading light above the empty seat switched on by itself. Only that one. A soft circle of warm light illuminated the chair. For the first time since the journey began. It wasn't empty. The gray-coated man sat calmly in seat 22D. Hands folded. Hat resting on his knees. He looked exactly as he had in the reflections. Only now. Everyone could see him. A woman near the front gasped. "So that's him." The businessman whispered. "I thought he was sitting there the whole trip." Another passenger frowned. "What do you mean? He boarded in New York." "No, he didn't." "Yes, he did. I remember speaking to him." "So do I." Within seconds the entire carriage erupted into arguments. Half the passengers insisted the stranger had been there from the beginning. The other half swore they had never seen him before. Claire looked directly into the man's eyes. They weren't frightening. They were unbearably sad. As though he had watched this exact scene unfold countless times. Then he finally spoke. His voice was calm. Soft. Almost gentle. "I've been trying." He paused. "To get off this train." Another pause. "For 38 years. And then every window in the carriage shattered at the same time. The explosion of glass sounded like a gunshot that never ended. Thousands of razor-sharp fragments burst inward, scattering across the carriage in a glittering wave. Passengers screamed. Several instinctively threw themselves into the aisle, covering their heads. Others grabbed children and pulled them beneath the seats. Claire raised her arms to protect her face. She expected the sting of shattered glass. It never came. Instead, the fragments stopped. They simply hung in the air. Every tiny piece of glass floated motionless, suspended only inches from where it had broken free. The entire carriage froze. Not just the glass. The rain outside no longer fell. It remained suspended beyond the shattered windows like millions of crystal beads. Steam rising from abandoned coffee cups stopped halfway into the air. A newspaper drifting toward the floor no longer moved. Even the emergency light above seat 22D flickered once. Then became perfectly still. Claire slowly lowered her hands. Her breathing was the only sound she could hear. No. Not the only sound. Someone else was breathing. The man in seat 22D. He stood. For the first time since she had seen him, he moved naturally. Without the strange, almost mechanical stillness that had defined him until now. He adjusted the cuff of one black glove. Looked around the frozen carriage. Then smiled sadly. "So." His voice echoed through the impossible silence. "This is the first time in years." Claire stared at him. "You." He nodded before she could finish. "Yes. I can move." Robert looked around in horror. "What have you done?" The stranger slowly shook his head. "I didn't do this." His eyes drifted toward the shattered windows. "This happens every time." Claire took a cautious step forward. The floating shards of glass parted around her as though an invisible force guided them aside. She looked at the stranger. "Who are you?" He remained silent for several moments. When he finally answered, his voice carried an exhaustion that no ordinary person could fake. "My name." He stopped. Closed his eyes. A faint smile crossed his face. "I almost remembered." Claire frowned. "You don't know your own name?" "I used to." He looked toward the ghost train outside. "I've forgotten it so many times. That only pieces remain." Claire felt the same chill she had experienced when Emily forgot her own identity. "You're losing your memory." The stranger nodded. "Not only mine." He slowly turned toward the frozen passengers. "Everyone who stays here long enough forgets." Robert whispered. "Stays where?" The stranger looked directly at him. "Between arrivals." Neither Claire nor Robert understood. The man seemed to realize that. He slowly walked toward one of the shattered windows. His footsteps produced no sound. Outside, Blackridge Station remained frozen beneath the motionless rain. The ghost train still waited on the opposite platform. Its passengers hadn't moved either. "They're waiting," Claire said quietly. The stranger nodded. "They always wait." "For what?" "For someone to take my place." Silence. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. What does that mean? He looked at his own reflection in the broken glass still suspended in midair. 38 years ago. I boarded the wrong train. Claire remembered the words he had mouthed through the window. You're on the wrong train. He continued. I was supposed to travel to Boston. My wife was already there. She was pregnant. A faint sadness entered his eyes. I never arrived. Claire listened without interrupting. I fell asleep. When I woke, Blackridge Station was outside the window. Robert slowly whispered. October 9th. The stranger looked at him with quiet surprise. You know the date. Robert nodded. My notebook. The man smiled faintly. So someone remembered. Claire stepped closer. What happened after that? I got off. His answer was immediate. I thought the train had broken down. He looked toward the empty platform. There was another train waiting. I believed it would take me home. He paused. I boarded. His expression changed. It wasn't going home. Claire felt every word sinking deeper into her chest. What was it? The stranger looked directly into her eyes. I still don't know. It keeps moving. Always at night. Always stopping at stations that no longer exist. Robert's breathing became uneven. And the people? They forget. Eventually. They stop asking where they're going. Claire looked toward the ghost train again. The passengers still sat perfectly still. Watching. Waiting. They're alive. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he asked a question. Have you ever noticed how memories disappear? Claire frowned. What? You don't lose yesterday first. You lose little things. The smell of your childhood home. The sound of someone's laugh. The face of your first teacher. He looked down at his gloved hands. Then one day, you forget your own name. Claire suddenly understood why Emily had looked so frightened. The stranger continued. And once nobody remembers your name, the other train saves a seat. He slowly turned toward seat 22D. The seat is never empty. Claire felt a wave of realization. You're the passenger. He nodded. The one who wasn't supposed to be here. Suddenly, a tiny sound echoed somewhere inside the frozen carriage. Tick. Robert looked at his watch. The second hand had moved. Only once. Then again. Tick. Outside. One raindrop finally fell. The frozen world had begun moving again. The stranger looked toward the station. His calm expression disappeared for the first time. They're coming. Claire frowned. Who? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the rear of the train. From somewhere beyond coach 5. A long line of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the frozen silence. Not one person. Not two. Dozens. Walking toward them. In perfect synchronization. The footsteps echoed through the train with impossible precision. Not hurried. Not hesitant. Each step landed at exactly the same moment, creating a rhythm so perfectly synchronized that it no longer sounded human. It resembled the steady ticking of an enormous clock hidden somewhere beyond the walls of the carriage. Step. 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 Claire turned toward the connecting door at the rear of coach 3. Nothing appeared. Only darkness. The lights throughout the train remained frozen in a dim twilight, illuminating little more than vague outlines of seats and motionless passengers. The stranger in the gray overcoat lowered his head. They've realized you're awake. Claire frowned. What does that mean? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the carriage at the frozen people. They're still asleep. Claire followed his gaze. Everyone remained exactly where they had been when time stopped. A businessman leaned halfway into the aisle. A child still clutched a floating stuffed rabbit. An elderly woman remained frozen in the middle of a breath. Only 3 people could move freely. Claire. Robert. And the stranger. Robert finally found his voice. Who are they? The man looked toward the darkness beyond the rear door. The conductors. A cold silence followed. Robert laughed nervously. I'm a conductor. The stranger slowly shook his head. No. You're a railway employee. They are something else. The footsteps grew louder. Closer. Claire could now distinguish individual pairs of shoes striking the floor in perfect unison. There had to be at least 20 of them. Maybe more. Yet no shadows appeared beneath the doorway. The stranger spoke again. They don't like passengers remembering. Claire looked at him. Remembering what? The truth. He slowly removed one of his black gloves. Claire immediately noticed his hand. It wasn't injured. It wasn't burned. It simply looked transparent. Not completely. Just enough for the seats behind it to remain faintly visible through his skin. Claire stared. What happened to you? I've been here too long. His voice carried no fear. Only resignation. The longer someone remains between trains, the less real they become. Robert instinctively stepped backward. This can't be happening. The stranger smiled sadly. It already has. The footsteps suddenly stopped. Complete silence filled the carriage. Claire looked toward the rear door. Still nothing. Then. A soft knock. 3 slow taps against the glass window of the connecting door. Knock. 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 No one moved. Another 3 taps. Exactly the same rhythm. The stranger closed his eyes. They're asking permission. Claire whispered. Permission for what? To come aboard. Robert frowned. They're already on the train. No. The stranger looked directly at him. They can't enter. Unless someone invites them. Before either of them could respond, a calm voice echoed from beyond the closed door. Ticket inspection. The voice sounded perfectly ordinary. Friendly. Professional. Exactly like any railway employee making a routine announcement. Claire almost relaxed. Almost. Then she realized something. The voice belonged to no one she had met. Robert seemed to notice the same thing. He slowly shook his head. There isn't another conductor scheduled tonight. The voice came again. Ticket inspection. A pause. Please open the door. Claire looked through the small glass window. A figure stood outside. Dark railway uniform. Conductor's cap. Hands folded politely in front of him. His face remained hidden beneath the brim. He didn't move. He simply waited. Robert swallowed. What happens if we ignore him? The stranger answered quietly. He keeps asking. And eventually. Someone answers. The voice returned. This time slightly louder. Ticket inspection. The frozen passengers, who until now had remained completely motionless, suddenly began moving. Not fully. Only their heads. One by one. Every frozen face slowly turned toward the rear door. Eyes still empty. Bodies still motionless. Only their heads moved. Claire counted instinctively. 1, 2, 5, 10, 20. Soon every passenger in the carriage faced exactly the same direction. Toward the waiting conductor. The stranger whispered. They're listening. Claire felt panic rising. What do we do? He looked directly into her eyes. Whatever happens. Don't tell him your name. The voice outside became strangely patient. Almost comforting. Miss Morgan. Claire froze. Robert stared at her. Neither of them had spoken her name. The conductor outside continued. Claire Morgan. We only need to verify your ticket. Her heartbeat accelerated. The stranger's expression changed instantly. He knows. Robert stepped in front of Claire. How? The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the frozen passengers. One little boy slowly opened his mouth. Then an elderly woman. Then another passenger. Within seconds, every frozen person in the carriage began speaking together. Not loudly. Barely above a whisper. Yet hundreds of voices merged into one. They all repeated the same sentence. Claire Morgan. Claire Morgan. Claire Morgan. Over and over. The sound filled the carriage like an endless echo. The conductor outside knocked once more. Thank you. I found the passenger. Then the door handle slowly began turning by itself. The handle completed its slow turn. The latch clicked. The rear door opened by only a few inches. A freezing wind swept through the carriage, carrying with it the scent of old paper, rain-soaked wood, and rusted steel. The conductor stepped inside. His polished black shoes made no sound against the floor. His uniform looked immaculate despite the storm outside. Every button reflected the dim light. A silver pocket watch hung from a thin chain across his vest. His cap still hid most of his face. Only a pale smile remained visible. He carried an old leather ticket punch in one hand. Not a scanner. Not a tablet. A ticket punch from another century. The whispers immediately stopped. Every frozen passenger fell silent. The conductor removed his cap. Claire expected to see a stranger. Instead, she saw herself. Not exactly. The face resembled her own, but older. Tired. Almost empty. The eyes contained no life, only endless exhaustion. Claire instinctively stepped backward. What? The conductor smiled gently. Every passenger sees someone different. Robert looked horrified. What do you see? Claire answered without taking her eyes off the figure. Myself. The stranger in the gray overcoat nodded sadly. So did I. Claire looked at him. You. When I first met him. The conductor ignored both of them. He slowly opened a worn ledger filled with hundreds of handwritten names. Some had been crossed out. Others had faded almost completely. Near the bottom of the last page, a blank line waited. The conductor raised his fountain pen. Name. Claire remained silent. She remembered the warning. Don't tell him your name. The conductor waited patiently. Name. Still nothing. A faint smile crossed his lips. You've already answered once. Claire frowned. I never spoke. You did. He pointed toward the frozen passengers. They remembered you. Claire suddenly understood. It wasn't her voice that mattered. It was memory. As long as someone remembered who she was. He knew. The stranger quietly stepped forward. Take mine. The conductor finally looked at him. I already did. 38 years of sadness filled the stranger's face. You promised. I promised nothing. The conductor calmly closed the ledger. You refused your station. You remained aboard. You knew the rules. Claire looked between them. What rules? The stranger sighed. When Blackridge appears, someone must leave. Robert slowly whispered. Or. The stranger looked at seat 22D. The train keeps searching. Silence settled over the carriage. Claire replayed every strange event in her mind. The disappearing passengers. Forgotten names. Photographs. The ghost train. Everything pointed toward one terrifying truth. Seat 22D wasn't haunted. It was. Waiting. Waiting for someone who belonged elsewhere. The conductor extended his hand toward Claire. It is time. Before anyone could react, Emily's stuffed rabbit suddenly fell onto the floor. The sound echoed unnaturally loudly. The little girl wasn't frozen anymore. She looked around in confusion. Then toward Claire. Without hesitation she shouted. Don't go. Her voice shattered the silence. One by one, the frozen passengers blinked. A businessman gasped. An elderly woman lowered her knitting. Children began crying. Time rushed back into the carriage all at once. The floating glass crashed harmlessly onto the floor. Rain resumed outside. The station lights flickered violently. The conductor's calm expression changed for the first time. He looked surprised. The stranger smiled. They remembered. Around the carriage, passengers began calling to one another. Claire. Robert. Emily. Names echoed everywhere. Parents hugged children. Husbands called for wives. Friends reached for friends. No one realized what they were actually doing. They were remembering. The conductor slowly stepped backward. His ledger closed by itself. No. His voice carried genuine disappointment. They chose each other. The stranger looked at Claire. That's how you leave. She understood. Not through courage. Not through sacrifice. Through memory. As long as people remembered one another. No seat remained empty. The station outside began dissolving into fog. Brick walls faded. The ancient train blurred like watercolor in the rain. Its silent passengers slowly disappeared one by one. Some smiled. Some simply closed their eyes. The gray-coated stranger looked toward the ghost train. For the first time since Claire had met him. He looked peaceful. I remember. Claire turned. What? My name. He smiled. Thomas. Just Thomas. No surname. No explanation. Only the one thing he had searched for during 38 endless years. The conductor removed his cap. He gave Thomas a respectful nod. Then both figures faded into the white mist beyond the open doorway. Blackridge Station vanished with them. The train lurched violently. The emergency brakes released. Lights returned. Engines roared back to life. Outside the windows. Only ordinary forest stretched beneath the early morning sky. The digital clocks suddenly changed. 2:23 a.m. Every phone updated at once. Signals returned. Passengers looked around in confusion. Many believed they had fallen asleep. Others remembered fragments. A strange station. A little girl crying. A man in a gray coat. Nothing more. When Train 71 finally arrived in Chicago just after sunrise, railway officials found no mechanical faults. The GPS logs showed no interruption. The engineers remembered driving the entire journey without stopping. According to every official record, Blackridge Station had never appeared. Claire spent months investigating. She searched railway archives, newspaper collections, engineering records, and historical maps. Eventually she found one forgotten newspaper from October 10, 1987. A single paragraph on the last page caught her attention. It described a small rural station named Blackridge, destroyed by a landslide during the night. One overnight passenger train had narrowly avoided disaster after receiving an emergency signal moments before reaching the station. The article mentioned one casualty. A passenger who left the train during the confusion. His body was never found. His name. Thomas Walker. Claire visited the place where Blackridge Station had once stood. Nothing remained except abandoned tracks disappearing into the trees. As she turned to leave, she noticed something lying beside the old rails. A worn black leather glove. Perfectly preserved. She picked it up. Inside the glove rested a folded ticket. The ink had almost faded away. Only 2 words remained readable. Seat 22D. Claire smiled sadly. She folded the ticket, placed it back beneath the glove, and left it exactly where she had found it. Some journeys don't end when the train reaches its destination. Some only end when someone remembers your name.